there. Yep. Sorry about this, but it's regulation, as they say. What time is it? Oh, it's 11:04. Well, you better get started, I suppose. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this press conference, today's press conference here at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. I'm Anthony Rowley. I'm a former president of the club, and I'm a member of the Professional Activities Committee, which organizes these events. And the subject, as you know, of today's session is climate change and lobbying of Japan Inc., and between promise and reality. Speaker on my right is Mr. Dylan Tanner, who is Executive Director and co-founder of InfluenceMap, which describes itself as, quotes, an independent think tank producing data-driven analysis on how business and finance are impacting the climate crisis. And of course, obviously, needless to say, today's event is very timely given the manifestations of the climate crisis we have right outside. InfluenceMap is based in England or in the UK and prides itself on not being afraid to, quote, take on big corporate names when it comes to issues like climate change. Last year, the group, which tracks corporate lobbying, listed Toyota as the third worst company for lobbying against climate policies after oil companies like ExxonMobil and Chevron. So today our speaker is going to explain why corporate lobbying matters, why more institutional investors care about what companies say behind closed doors, and what role industry associations play, especially in Japan, which is his country of expertise. In fact, Mr. Tanner grew up in Japan and founded, prior to founding InfluenceMap in 2015, he established the environmental consultancy group ERM Japan in Tokyo, which was involved in environmental audits, land remediation, corporate sustainability, and climate strategies. Please join me in welcoming today's speaker.
Thank you. Sound okay? So yes, I did grow up in Japan, and it's great to be back after 2.5 years, almost 3 years. I have many fond memories of the FCCJ when I was living here and working here. And I should say, working in the environmental sector in Japan, we had lots and lots of contact with the corporate sector, the finance sector, and so I have a lot of experience and understanding of the interplay between government and finance and business and policy making in the environmental arena. So also have a great respect for the corporate sector in Japan and their contributions to clean technology, innovation, etc. over the years. So today's topic is the climate crisis and how corporations have impacted the climate agenda over the years and continue to do so, and I will mention this in the context of Japan and the Japanese corporate sector. A little bit about InfluenceMap in case you don't know. We are a think tank based in London, founded in 2015, right before the Paris Agreement on climate, one of the many agreements that seem to continue. We have offices in Tokyo and New York, and the work stream relevant today is called LobbyMap, which is the main assessment platform in the world for tracking corporate influence over climate policy, which is very important, and I will explain why in a minute. I should say we don't really take down companies, as you suggest. We just generate the data that allows other much more powerful forces to act and make change in the world. So.
Right.
Key distinction there. No, sorry, I'm just being. But we do our work. We're mission-driven, not for profit. All our work is open source, and our mission is to facilitate climate solutions by governments and removing this systemic blockage we call lobbying that's been manifested itself over the years and has held back progress. So as I mentioned, we're kind of the data people. We generate compelling and honest content on this topic. And a key partnership we've developed over the years is with the investment community. shareholders in large corporations who essentially own them and in theory, should be able to control their governance. I will explain later why the financial community is now so intimately interested in removing this systemic blockage of lobbying, and we work closely with them. And we also work with the media. We have a big database online. We track this stuff, and we help the media fact-check corporate statements and control greenwash. And we also generate media reports, which are covered by media around the world. And we've done a lot of work in Japan in this respect. And also we work with companies who genuinely want to see change on climate. They may have green business models, low carbon business models, and they want to the governments to act to help level the playing field so they can pursue that. So a lot of big forces we work with to make change on this topic. Just a note to say we don't take policy positions ourselves. We rely on, as a benchmark, the intent of governments. Governments have been wanting to act on climate change for several decades. They've been stymied by corporate delaying tactics. We also rely on something called the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's part of the UN process. It's about several thousand scientists, various disciplines, who form the consensus on climate science, but also the consensus on what policymakers should do. And they offer regular policymaker briefings based on the science and economics and technology and other factors that feed in. And there's some very important conclusions which they continue to make, and they're getting very specific as the climate crisis worsens on what needs to happen and under what timelines. And I would just want to mention a few of these because it's very important for the lobbying narrative that I'm going to tell you about. The first and most fundamental point that the IPCC says is that strong binding government regulations are the central pillar of climate solutions. We hear a lot about voluntary corporate targets or ESG or kind of citizen action. Well, the IPCC says these are all facilitators. What needs to happen is the governments need to set the rules, and all of these other things will fall into place. Without that, it's not going to happen fast enough. So the need for strong regulation is central. Also, they came out with a report in 2018 called Global Warming of 1.5C, which sets a series of conditions which need to happen if we're to reach that target and avoid catastrophic climate change, global warming. By far, the most specific topic they mentioned was the role of thermal coal in electric power. It's the biggest polluter of greenhouse gases. By 2030, coal should be between 7 and 14% of global generation and be phased out by 2050. And so that should be a benchmark for policymakers, and that's something we measure corporate statements by. It makes statements on the use of gas in power generation, and also, importantly for Japan, the role of low-carbon hydrogen. It recommends rapid electrification of land transport. Electric vehicles powered by low-emission electricity offers the largest decarbonization potential for land-based transport, so electric vehicles. And also importantly, the latest statements from the IPCC play down the role of carbon capture and storage and unproven technologies as a way of justifying continued use of burning fossil fuels. This is important to understand because a lot of companies and industry associations make statements saying we don't support this because we can use carbon capture and storage to continue doing the status quo. Well, the consensus of the scientists is that using economically and scientifically unproven technologies sometime in the future is no substitute for a transition to proven and economically viable low-carbon energies. Okay. So I repeat, the IPCC points to the central role of governments to combat climate change. And this has been something the corporate sector in Japan has Well, they've resisted for decades. Their alternative is voluntary sector-based corporate targets and plans, not binding, not regulated, which are fed through to the government through the Japan Business Federation as a solution. And they've resisted any kind of regulatory or binding mechanisms over the years. The problem with that is it doesn't work. Without binding rules, there's no consequences for non-compliance. And companies who don't feel like incurring the costs of compliance don't have to. So I should point to an analogy here from Japan in the 1970s. I don't know if anyone is old enough to. Japan was suffering some of the worst industrial pollution to ever occur. And I recall as a kid seeing policemen with gas masks directing traffic because the air was so bad, water was bad. So in the early 70s, the Japanese government formed the Environment Agency and enacted very strict regulations for air, water, waste, and chemicals. These are mandatory, not voluntary targets. And the entire industry, over a period of 2 or 3 years, had to invest heavily in pollution abatement, and the problem was solved. All the companies invested at the same time, incurred the same burden, and none were at a competitive loss. So that is, it leveled the playing field and created the environment for investment in low polluting technologies. And as a result, Japan was very competitive in these technologies, and that combined with the oil shock, where the price of oil jumped by 10 times, created an extremely efficient and low polluting industry for Japan. But this hasn't happened in climate change because the industry has insisted on this voluntary approach. Okay, so what's happened in Japan has been mirrored in other parts of the world. In no countries do we have sufficient policy progress. And I want to give you a mapping of what the Climate Action Tracker, which is a reliable guide to tracking each country's national NDC, national determined. It's their plan they submit to the United Nations to fulfill the Paris Agreement. Black indicates completely out of sync with targets. Red is somewhat out of sync. Orange is dubious, down to green. The only country in green, I believe, is Estonia. Very misaligned, includes the United States, Canada, Brazil, China, and India, Australia, and somewhat misaligned Japan, Europe, and the United States. So this is not just an issue in Japan. The entire world has not enacted enough policy, sufficient policy to reach the target of 1.5 C warming limited. So, you could argue there's several reasons for this. Political differences between emerging and developed countries. One of the reasons we believe is fundamental, and it's been cited by many politicians, UN officials, and policymakers, is this persistent opposition from the corporate sector to anything binding, or parts of the corporate sector, anything binding that will disadvantage or phase out certain parts of polluting industries. And this has been going on for 3 decades. You may recall the Kyoto Protocol of 1997, where the world thought it had finally come together and agreed climate change was a huge global problem. I remember I was there. I attended that almost 25 years ago. U.S. Vice President flew in at the last minute to kind of create the agreement, and there was a great discussion of a global carbon tax as the quickest, simplest way of solving this problem and creating that level playing field. In fact, I was working in a consulting firm advising Japanese companies, you better be prepared for this. There's going to be a high price on carbon, but we all know what happened. I'll give you a quote. A few years after the agreement, the U.S. President, George W. Bush, pulled out of the agreement. He didn't ratify, and to quote, he said, ExxonMobil has advised me that this ratification of this treaty will be uncompetitive for the United States. So talk about blatant, lobbying. I mean, so to say that he sought advice from the world's largest oil firm to decide the future on that. And that's just one data point in numerous of how the corporate sector got to work before and after the Kyoto agreements, and they saw the writing on the wall for the oil and gas industry, and they thought we need to strategically stop this effort. Since then, we've had 26 further COPs around the world, including the landmark one in Paris and one in Glasgow last year, which I both attended. Repeated commitments from governments to act on climate, and now companies are making top-line net zero commitments. But this is a stream of messaging that goes on up here. Below, where the needed regulations that I described are supposed to be happening, there's not that kind of action. There's not the same talk. There's this huge disconnect between the needed policy and regulations that should be happening, and then this continued almost global circus of big climate summits with new commitments, new pledges for the trillions to flow from governments and from companies. At the same time, the IPCC itself is frustrated at all this. Scientists have been saying this needs to happen for years, and they're now talking about opposition from status quo interests as to why it hasn't happened. The UN Secretary General recently made quite strong comments about fossil fuel interests influencing both the UN process and also regulatory processes around the world. So this is why we devote so much time to tracking this in great detail. Unless you understand the system, you can't change the system. I'll give you another world map, which shows the attempts by governments over the years to legislate on climate. All of these have been delayed, stopped, or watered down by corporate lobbying. UN emissions, the EU emissions trading scheme, the US clean power plan, and carbon taxes around the world. So what is this? What does this lobbying look like? This is not a well understood corporate function. You can't go onto a company website and see this is our lobbying department. It's quite a undisclosed and discrete activity. It's variously described as advocacy, policy engagement, lobbying, and it's carried out by sections of the company termed by government relations, external relations, the legal department, public affairs, etc. And just all in all, it's a very poorly disclosed process. And given this lack of transparency, the UN in 2014 published a kind of a guide for how companies should responsibly engage on climate policy. And this lists a whole bunch of activities relating to advertising, social media, public relations, sponsoring research, direct meetings with regulators, paying off regulators, using funding of campaigns and political parties, participation in policy advisory and technical committees, and also the use of external agents who do all of those same things, but without the company's name on it. And that's a really important point I want to get to in a minute. So all of these are part of a strategic corporate effort to influence government policy, many different policy areas. We're talking about climate change here. And an important part of that is to influence the public discourse and narrative around in which policymakers need to act. And we've heard, or we know about, or we've heard about the climate denial activities emanating from the oil and gas sector in the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s. So the first attempt was to deny the science, and that's unviable, and that's migrated to seemingly accepting and even being positive on climate, but then thwarting action. And you can see how this has manifested itself from ExxonMobil over the years, where now even Exxon is almost seemingly supporting things like carbon taxes, knowing full well that they've created this environment where they're no longer feasible within the political process. I just want to say one thing more about this. It's kind of the narrative and the public discourse on climate change, and this is a really important and nuanced activity which is conducted by the corporate sector, which is to appear positive while engaging in misinformation, and it's manifests itself in terms of underplaying certain things, cherry-picking data and details to highlight positive things and create a narrative which you want to propagate. And one really interesting example is a few years ago, Exxon's advertising campaign was around its algae-based biofuel, algae-engineered biofuels, and this made up possibly half of the company's advertising. You would think this company was a biofuels company. And we computed that actually its spending on the advertising outweighed the actual R&D and into the biofuels itself. And they were sued by the Massachusetts Attorney General for basically false advertising and misleading investors over that. And that's just one example that exists, and the oil and gas sector is spending literally billions to create this narrative of we're positive, we're part of the solution, while carrying out these delaying tactics that I just mentioned, either directly or through their industry associations. So, we track the stuff that we know about, like that advertising, because it's in the public domain, so we can see it. And there's other, elements of this lobbying activity, like public consultations, media articles about CEO statements. When new policies are being submitted, companies and trade associations can submit comments to those, which you would think would be their genuine opinions. Otherwise, they wouldn't get them to be conveyed. But there's a whole lot of activities, private meetings, donations that are not disclosed, a whole bunch of other things that we cannot find out about. But we determined that what we do know about is indicative of the general behavior of the companies and the industry associations that we track. And that's quite well accepted by the investment community who uses our data. So they want to know about the behavior of these companies and what their views are on climate. I want to say one thing about, I mentioned industry associations and their role in this whole process. And the reason they are so powerful is because they go to regulators and politicians and say, look, we represent the entire economy. We represent jobs and growth. And if you do this, then this will happen to jobs and growth, and you will be disadvantaged in your next election. And that's a tried and tested method of swaying policy most places in the world: Europe, United States, Japan. Some of the most powerful of such groups are these kind of federations, chambers of commerce that say they represent the entire economy. And their membership, it consists of both companies and industry associations, federations like the Japan Business Federation. Hugely powerful because they can say, well, not only do we represent one sector, we represent everybody, the whole economy, and this is our view. But the way these organizations work is when a policy issue comes up, they take the position of the most negatively affected companies. And so it's not it doesn't appear to be a democratic process. And it's kind of when your turn comes up, you get your position taken, and when it doesn't, you keep your nose out, is sort of the unwritten agreement we think in these groups. And so with some of these big groups like the Chamber of Commerce and the Japan Business Federation and the equivalent in Europe, which is Business Europe, this has produced a disconnect between what is increasingly the majority of members who have really climate positive statements and nominally may want to see that more ambitious climate policy, but versus the fossil fuel value chain companies whose lowest common denominator positions these groups adopt and kind of push. And one of the most problematic groups is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, who has consistently opposed every effort by the U.S. government to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. And we measure the Chamber's score there. It's bordering on an E-, it's moved from an F to an E-, but still way more negative than most of its highly powerful members, you know, in tech, financial, healthcare, and media and other industries. And you know, this disconnect hasn't gone unnoticed, and there are efforts underway to try and resolve it. But the organizations remain extremely powerful. Okay, so I want to speak a bit about the investor agenda on climate change, and you know, this is a group that we work, financial institutions who represent shareholders in these companies, is a group we spend a lot of time working with around the world. In particular, very large financial institutions like pension funds or large integrated asset managers holding $1 trillion or more of equity in companies and assets worldwide. And they're concerned about the lobbying issue for two reasons. One is they consider themselves to be universal owners. That means they are invested in the entire market, usually globally. They don't pick stocks as such. And they see the encroaching climate emergency as presenting a systemic risk to economies, societies, and therefore the vast majority of their assets in the portfolio. And they need to often answer to beneficiaries like citizens, savers, and if they're government pension funds or wealth funds, the parliaments of the country concerned. So they're keen to stop the negative lobbying on climate emanating from what is increasingly a tiny part of their corporate holdings. So it's kind of the systems issue. The second is company-specific risk. Climate regulations eventually probably will be enacted, and they will have profound impacts on many industries: oil, gas, power, chemicals, automotive. And investors want to know how the companies are dealing with these regulations. The classic example is Dieselgate. Before then, Volkswagen was telling everybody it was one of the most sustainable automotive companies in the world. Behind the scenes, it was cheating on emissions regulation. European auto companies had effectively captured European regulators on emissions regulations. That capture was loosened dramatically after Dieselgate, where the regulators in Europe felt emboldened to push back. So in individual corporate risk, investors are keenly interested when they're told something by companies and the company's doing something else behind the scenes, this kind of greenwash disconnect type issue. So the current demand, based on our work with investors, is they want a lot more disclosure on lobbying and lobbying activities, as I described earlier, by both the companies and their industry associations, and they want them to correct these misalignments that I mentioned, like in the Chamber of Commerce, where you have your external agent doing the exact opposite of what you say you want to be done. So that is underway, and we've seen shareholder resolutions at about 30, 40 companies specifically on the climate lobbying issue, and we've seen a whole batch of disclosures of varying qualities coming from companies, including Toyota last year. And I think this process will accelerate, and there will be more heat, so to speak, on companies to kind of be more transparent and clean up their negative lobbying.
I draw you to a close fairly
Okay. I'm going to make some comments about our work in Japan. We're interested in Japan as it's, the financial sector has a lot of exposure. Climate policies are not as ambitious as they might be, and also when it comes to energy and industrial policy, there's strong capture of policy by the corporate sector. We did a detailed study of 50 industry groups in Japan to look at their positions on climate policy and also the intensity of their policy engagement under various climate streams emerging. And this is just a snapshot of the results. Probably may not surprise you. A few of the heavy emitting and power sector and fossil fuel related sectors within the economy were doing the vast bulk of the strategic policy engagement. And it was mostly all negative, opposing any policy action. The rest of the economy representing finance, real estate, healthcare, etc., very superficial kind of top line type policy engagement only. And the result is that the minority strategically influencing, policy engaging part of the economy, it continues to continue to win out. And we will be updating this analysis quite soon and releasing a platform on this. I want to say something about the role of the Japan Business Federation in this. It represents a lot of the sector-based associations as well as companies. And like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the reason it's powerful, it says it establishes a consensus in the business community on various topics. So in other words, it says it represents the business community. Our research indicates that on the climate issue, it doesn't in fact represent the consensus. It represents the views of a small section of the economy representing power and heavy emitting industries. The other sectors making up 70% or more of Japan's economy have different policies and views on climate and want to see stronger action. Also, Japan Business Federation doesn't in fact represent key sectors like retail and logistics and fisheries. They're not members. So, its statement that it represents the business community in Japan should be challenged, and there should be some scrutiny of its remit to do that. So I will make some closing comments, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. Very interesting on the Machiavellian tactics of the corporate sector. Okay, we'll turn to questions. First from the floor. Do we have questions from the floor? Anyone from the floor? If not, I have a number of online questions waiting. The first one is from Eric Johnston of the Japan Times. He says, in addition to publicly listed corporations in Japan, have you been able to identify any individuals, foundations, think tanks, NPOs or NGOs that are fronts for political lobbying against tougher climate policies by the Japanese government? That's the first part of it. Second part, have you identified any specific Japanese politicians or political groups, such as official Diet member organizations, as lobbying against strict climate change policies on behalf of corporate citizens? I mean, we mostly study the corporate sector and entities whose remit can be traced back to companies, because that's the investors are the lever we use. And so where we don't know who the group is representing or who's funding it, we don't really look too closely. But my personal view is the vast majority of influencing is done directly by the corporate sector itself, specifically by the industry associations and the Japan Business Federation. Okay, the second one is from Martin Curling, who's with the German paper Handelsblatt. It's rather similar to some. He says, how strong is the influence of industry lobbies on government decisions in Japan compared to other countries? Two, are there any typical Japanese channels for lobby groups to influence decisions? What about the numerous councils that draft policies? Actually, you've got two more parts of the question, but perhaps you want to answer those two first.
So, as I mentioned, I think there's less room for other stakeholders to input into the, I'd say, industrial policy process in Japan than, say, you have in Europe and the United States, where you have a variety of civil society, maybe labor unions and others playing a role. And so I think it's, it's not completely captured, but I think that the role of industry is much stronger in Japan. And the other part was?
Well, the second one was, are there any typical Japanese channels for lobby groups? That you've answered it.
Yeah, no. I mean, there are committees within METI that companies and academics can join.
Okay, he then goes on to say, you're critical of Tokyo, ranking it lowest in your recent...
You mean Toyota?
Toyota.
Yeah.
Sorry, didn't I say Toyota?
You said Tokyo.
Anyway. You're critical of Toyota, ranking it lowest in your recent car manufacturing survey, I think. But Toyota stepped up their EV goals recently to 30 to 40% of their sales by 2030. Why do you rate it so much lower? Have you observed a change in lobbying behavior on the part of Toyota? And finally, what recommendation do you have to strengthen the role of pro-emission control lobbies in Japan and restrain the traditional lobbies? So
we measure what the companies are lobbying on right now. We don't measure on their targets in terms of what they say they think they will do in 10 years. So that, the entire automotive sector is somewhat negative on the onslaught of what will be battery electric and regulations around emissions, internal combustion.
Mm-hmm.
But our data suggests Toyota's one of the most negative globally.
Okay, all right. Well, the final part was, what recommendation do you have to strengthen the role of pro-emission control lobbies in Japan?
That's what I alluded to. The whole process of how the Japan Business Federation forms positions on climate perhaps needs to be addressed more clearly, and which sectors, which companies are feeding into that, and to allow for other sectors input into the committees and governmental processes where METI, the Ministry of Economics, Trade and Industry, forms its policy positions.
Okay. Any question? I've got some, I guess. Isabel, please.
Hi, Isabel Reynolds from Bloomberg. Thanks very much for your presentation. I have one very basic question, which, sorry, I probably should have checked online before I came, but you're an independent think tank, so how are you funded? And the other one is about electric vehicles. It's kind of a technical question, so I don't know if you're the right person to ask, but I mean, there's some debate about switching to electrical vehicles. Does that really help if you are generating power from coal, for example, like Japan is? You basically on the assumption that someday we'll all be relying on renewable energy, and therefore at that point it will be environmentally friendly.
Did you get both of them?
Yeah, we're philanthropically funded by foundations around the world, I guess charitable foundations. So the IPCC has guidance on the power sector as well as electrification of transport, and it recommends phase out of fossil fuels, phase in of renewables. And it assumes that to reach 1.5, both of these event timelines are going to happen simultaneously, and so we will this is their guidance to policymakers. We will have a world where electric vehicles will be powered by clean energy. So one thing that we have observed is a narrative created by the automotive industry that this is the reason why we shouldn't switch to battery, because they're going to be powered by coal-based, but that's kind of a self-serving statement in that you're kind of saying that the renewable energy will not proliferate. Therefore, we don't need to bother with battery electric, and that's kind of in our view, a lobbying narrative that's being spun.
Isabel, are you happy with the second point? Was okay, fine. Okay, well, yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Andy Sharp from Nikkei Asia. Thanks for coming. So just broadly, in terms of lobbying against environmental regulations, etc., how do Japanese corporates compare with their global peers in the US, Europe, and the rest of Asia? Would you say, who is the biggest sinner? I mean, of the lot, basically, and how does Japan compare to? Obviously, it's company by company. It differs hugely, I'm sure, but how does it compare globally?
So Japan doesn't have such a big fossil fuel production sector, and I think historically a lot of the highly negative, almost strategic and ongoing lobbying has emanated from the fossil fuel production sector. And we produce a list of the 50 companies who are most powerful and most negative on climate, and I believe Toyota is the only Japanese company to make that list. The vast majority are US, European, and other companies engaged in the fossil fuel value chain and large utilities and the like. And also, I should say, in Japan, as I mentioned, that most of the lobbying work is done at the trade association level as opposed to the individual company level. Toyota's maybe a large global multinational active in, it's probably the most global player in the automotive sector. So our data on that company is global in nature, not just around Japan.
Okay, the next two questions move slightly outside of strict lobbying, but we have one from David McNeil of the Irish Times. He says, my sense from consuming the Japanese media is that it's slow to make the connection between extreme weather, such as heavier rainfall, hotter weather, and stronger typhoons and climate change. Do you agree? And could you speculate on why that is? In other words, why is the Japanese media so slow to link climate change with these disasters or potential disasters?
I think that's a comment of media. The IPCC is coming out with more and more conclusive statements of links between these weather events and climate change emanating from our activities. So yeah, I think we will see more coverage of this in Japan and elsewhere in the light of the extreme events.
So it's not that the Japanese media is in league with the...
I mean, that's not something we've studied in huge detail, but I'm just saying that they will follow the conclusive reports from the IPCC, I think.
All right. I have a question from an associate member, Howard Ihu, who says, Japan's energy policies have been terrible, he says. Only 5 gigawatts of wind energy. The US has 135 gigawatts of wind energy, producing electricity equivalent to 45 new nuclear reactors. Japan Inc. has not helped or have not helped. In your view, how can this be improved, if you have any views on that?
No, so I mean, we look, the lobbying by the power sector is done, on the policies, but also importantly on the technical level. A lot of the reasons for the cost imbalance or the cost competitiveness of renewables versus thermal powered is due to the detailed regulations around permitting, around storage and other things. Distributed renewable energy is a relatively new thing, and so new regulations around all this stuff have been implemented. And I think Japan has been slow to let go of the huge units, big nuclear, big thermal, in favor of, say, a distributed network and new players. And that's needed. Policy innovation is needed. The UK and Europe was in the same position as Japan 10, 15 years ago, and they innovated on policy, and now they're extremely cost competitive on renewables, and the industry is behind low carbon transition. So I think you know, a lot of times the argument, oh, renewables are way too expensive in Japan. Well, one of the reasons is because of the capture of these detailed technical regulations by the system. So it's a self-fulfilling statement.
Okay. I have a question myself, actually, which, if I may do a little advertising for myself, I have a book coming out next month on who is going to pay for the battle against the climate change. So my question is, you obviously reveal some very genuine attempts by the corporate sector perhaps to evade responsibility, but the fact is that it's going to cost an awful lot of money for the corporate sector to adapt to climate change and transitions and so on, new plant and equipment, all kinds of things. So to what extent do you think, or do you get feedback from the corporate sector saying, yes, it's all very well that you're keeping track of us, but have you thought about what it's going to cost to counter climate change, and who's going to pay it? Is it going to be corporate shareholders? Is it going to be taxpayers? Who? I mean, is there another side to this question?
Well, if you regulate the emissions properly, I mean, climate change is caused by polluting emissions, and they're solved by government regulations for those emissions, which have been resisted. The analogy with Japan in the 1970s, yeah, massive cost to clean it up, but it created this level playing field, and the money didn't have to come out of thin air or from some charitable kind of system. It was good business because that's the system in which the market was forced to operate. So I think the same thing needs to happen with climate. The price of carbon has to be much, much higher than it is, and then all of these trillions will flow, because that will be a profitable set of activities and create massive new economies and new opportunities, etc. But the regulations have to be there. I don't think finance is going to fill in, kind of put that level of money up without, and that's what the financial sector tells us. We're waiting for the regulatory signals from governments before we invest.
No, I understand that, but I just wondered whether the companies that you lobby and so, or you're in contact with, do say there are two sides to the story, or don't they? Do they?
I mean, the companies who are negatively lobbying complain about the costs and whatnot. But I think that one thing that we should be squared. The more we wait, the more draconian the regulations are going to be needed, and the more cost to them will have to be burdened.
Okay, any more questions from the... Isabel, please.
Hi, sorry, again, I think I'm going a little bit outside your research, but as somebody who grew up in Japan, you mentioned that the civil society groups seem to have less influence here in terms of environmental campaigning than in other parts of the world. Do you have any thoughts on why that might be?
Good question. I think the apparatus behind how such civil society groups are funded and regarded, and the recruitment of people to and the career paths that they provide is not so sophisticated as it is in the United States or Europe. Hopefully that will change. I think there's a need for that voice in that sector.
Do you have any comments on whether you're more pessimistic or optimistic? Now, I mean, obviously, as you said, there's a greater awareness now at all levels of the fact that climate change is a reality. It's dawning even on people who've been denying that for a long time. Do you think that is something that's going to work in the favor of a more cooperative attitude by corporates?
So yeah, I don't want to be like completely pessimistic and the Grinch like all the time. And there are some strong and good signals. We know just yesterday the Build Back Better climate provision from the Biden administration seems to have woken from the dead for the third time, and hopefully this time it will stay alive. I would also point to the Fit for 55 package in Europe, the most ambitious climate. And that, incidentally, was facilitated by strong support from the corporate sector, after being negative. So there is a pathway to this. And in that case, the catalyst was the electric power sector in Europe that brought the other sectors with them. So we hope and we are seeing some glimmer of positive signals from Japan's power sector and from the Keidanren on these topics. So we hope that will accelerate as Japan embarks on this new capitalism package of policy that needs to be fleshed out with regulations, and a lot of them are describing low carbon transition type stuff. So that is positive to think. I mean, we have to have hope that this is going to happen.
Well, let's hope
not
so.
just descend into chaos.
Last call for questions, if there is. If not, let's end on that positive note. But before we do, I'd just like to remind people, if they don't already know, that we have another climate event at 2:30 here in this club. It's called a deep dive, and we have 4 international panelists, experts, who are going to be talking about all kinds of aspects of the climate change crisis. So if you want to stay on and ask questions, then you're very welcome to stay on too, if you wish. But otherwise, thank you very much indeed for coming. It's a very interesting, timely and topical subject. We would like to present you, I don't seem to have it with me at the moment, but we present our speakers with a 1-year honorary membership of the club, which will reach
take full advantage of that.
So please come more often, make use of it. And in the meantime, thank you very much for your contributions.
Thank you everyone. Thank you, that was great.
Sorry?
That was great. I'll pick up that book.
Absolutely.
Okay.